What the Japanese failed to realize was that maximizing utility did not mean splitting up one's forces. Attempting multiple operations simultaneously held out the hope of more rapid conquest. But it was also very risky, because it opened the door to the possibility of one of the smaller formations being destroyed by a locally superior American force. If that happened, Japan's advantage in carriers would be prematurely destroyed as well. And once the Imperial Navy lost numerical superiority, it could never regain it. Maximizing utility, then, really involved applying the intellectual rigor necessary to determine which operations were truly worth conducting. Unfortunately, intellectual honesty and analytic exactitude were characteristics notably absent from the strategic discourses within the Imperial Navy at this time. Taking these observations regarding Cardiff 5 to their logical conclusion, Yamamoto should have realized that there were, in fact, precisely two types of objectives in the Pacific, those that were worth attacking with all 6 of Japan's fleet carriers, and those worth attacking with none. Until the enemy's carriers were destroyed, there was no middle ground on this matter. Japan, which had opened the war with a massed carrier strike across unprecedented distances, certainly ought to have been cognizant that the same trick could be played in reverse. The American carriers, all of them, had already demonstrated that they could appear practically anywhere on the perimeter of the Empire. There were no safe missions, such as Combined Fleet envisioned Operation MO to be. If the Americans were operating in force in the area, then Cardiff 5 and Operation MO would be placed in jeopardy, which in turn placed Operation MI in jeopardy as well. By the same token, if Operation MO was truly important enough to support with all of Kid Butai, then the overall operational schedule needed to be adjusted to reflect these realities. It was imperative that the Japanese carrier force applied its strategic potential at maximum strength everywhere it went. This meant accepting an operational tempo that afforded the carriers time between missions to rest and refit. In essence, the Japanese needed to recognize that their real problem was not one of resource allocation between multiple objectives, but rather scheduling multiple operations around a single finite resource. Neither Yamamoto nor Naval GHQ apparently ever apprehended this logic. Or if they did, they were so overconfident that they simply failed to notice their peril. Either way, the Imperial Navy was now attempting too much in too many places and with too few assets. If the Doolittle raid had a positive effect on American morale, it also soaked up the services of half of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's available carriers at a time when events in the South Pacific were coming rapidly to a head. American intelligence had become aware of Inoue's forthcoming operation in the Coral Sea, and Nimitz had to scramble to meet this new threat. The foundation for Nimitz's forthcoming deployments was a major intelligence coup, one that would influence the course of the entire Pacific War. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had broken the Imperial Japanese Navy's, IJN's, most important operational code, known as JN-25 in late March 1942. As a result, American cryptanalysts were becoming more successful in deciphering enough of the IJN's operational signals traffic to discern the overall intent of the Imperial Navy's plans. The nature of American code breaking was not such that the US Navy could simply read complete messages at will. They could only siphon a small number of transmissions from the veritable river of coded Japanese traffic. On an average day, the Americans were only intercepting around 60% of the Imperial Navy's transmissions. Of those, only about 40% of the messages could be analyzed because of lack of time and human resources. And even then, American cryptographers were rarely able to make out more than 10–15% of the code groups within any given transmission. Thus, code breaking in itself, though a vitally important advantage, was hardly a panacea. However, when coupled with traffic analysis, the art of deriving operational intelligence by deducing the identity of enemy call signs and then monitoring the pattern and extent of their radio transmissions, the Americans had gained a good sense for which messages were most likely to be important. As early as 9th of April, American intelligence noted the recent transmission of orders to Kaga, instructing her to be in the New Britain area by the end of the month. The following day, they deduced that another carrier, misidentified as Ryukaku, was to be used in the operation as well. Additional information suggested an accumulation of shipping and air assets at Truk and Rabaul. As a result, the Americans began to suspect that something was afoot in the South Pacific. In the opinion of the analysts, the strategic town of Port Moresby, located on the southern coast of New Guinea, was the likely objective. On the basis of this information, Nimitz decided to dispatch Lexington to the South Pacific in mid-April to back up Yorktown, which was already there. The problem was that with Hornet and Enterprise committed to Doolittle's operation, he had too few carriers to oppose a major Japanese offensive should all of Kid Butai be present. However, the fall of Port Moresby would place northern Australia in immediate peril, and Nimitz was determined to defend his southern communications lines. By 1st May, both Yorktown and Lexington were on station in the Coral Sea, with Hornet and Enterprise slated to join them by 14-16 May. But for the Doolittle raid, it is likely that the Japanese would have found Cardiff 5 opposed by not 2, but 4 American carriers. Had that occurred, it is possible that the Japanese would have been presented with an altogether more decisive battle than they had envisioned. Meanwhile, at Hashirajima, events rapidly moved forward. The capstone to the planning process took place on 1st May on board the battleship Yamato. She was to play host to a series of war games designed to solidify the operational aspects of MI. Here, in a series of map exercises conducted until the 5th, the operational plan was put to the test in front of the command staffs of the various task forces. The forward mess spaces were cleared of their normal furnishings, and a large table surrounded by chairs was put in place. Individual cabins around the ship were used as command posts for the operational staffs involved in the actual operation. At each, the unit's commander or chief of staff behaved as if he were standing on the bridge of his respective flagship, issuing orders that were relayed by runners to other commands in mimicry of radio communications. Wargaming is an old and respected adjunct to the formulation of military planning, allowing participants to explore issues and make revisions to their plans accordingly. Whatever rules are used, the emphasis during gaming is supposed to be on honestly identifying and correcting errors in operational concepts and preparing contingency plans. Yet from the get-go, the farcical nature of Operation MI's games was apparent to everyone present. Yamamoto clearly intended this conference not so much as a true exercise, but as a rubber stamp. During the games, Yamamoto's chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, frequently played the role of umpire. In that capacity, he consistently passed down rulings that glossed over the difficulties encountered by the Japanese. In this effort, Ugaki was aided by a lack of preparation for the exercise on the part of the various staff commands. The planning for the operation had proceeded at such a speed in April that proper briefing documents had only lately been distributed to the participants. Thus, the officers now on board Yamato had had very little opportunity to do their homework beforehand. Whether this was a deliberate maneuver on the part of Yamamoto and Ugaki, or simply a reflection of MI being thrown together too quickly, is unknown. The practical effects, however, were identical. The staff officers of the subordinate commands were in an inherently weaker position to criticize the plan's basic assumptions. As a result, they mostly went along with what they were told. The attitude of many of the participants, moreover, was that this exercise was little more than a formality. In contrast to the assiduous studies before Pearl Harbor, these games revealed a certain sloppiness. In the words of Nagasawa Ko, who went on to become a rear admiral in the Japanese naval self-defense forces after the war, the general tenor of the games was one of, "This is a necessary drill, but don't worry, we'll take care of anything that comes along." An attitude of bored indifference permeated the various commands, most notably that of 1st Air Fleet. Nagumo opposed the operation, but felt powerless to stop it. At a wedding that May, he remarked to a friend that his superiors spoke ill of him already, and that if he actively opposed the operation, his bravery would be called into question. All things considered, he went on to say, he would rather go to Midway and die than be branded as a coward. What Nagumo thought of the proceedings on board Yamato is not recorded, which is in itself interesting. As point man in the operation, he would have been within his rights to ask the sharpest questions of anyone. Yet he apparently voiced no concerns whatsoever. It must be recalled, though, that Nagumo was in a weak position to object to Yamamoto's plans in any case. He had been upbraided by his superior for his perceived lack of aggressiveness at Pearl Harbor, and he was clearly out of his element in discussing the complexities of air operations. Gender had to handle these questions for him. If Nagumo was guilty of being withdrawn, it shortly became clear that Yamamoto and his staff were engaged in being actively disingenuous. The character of the games was established early on when an officer in charge of playing the Red Forces, representing the American Navy, submitted a course of action that closely resembled the tactics that would be used by the Americans in the actual battle. Having shown up sooner than anticipated, while the invasion of Midway was in process, Red proceeded to attack Nagumo's flank. The Japanese carriers were heavily hit, and the invasion was placed in great difficulties. At this juncture, the table judge demurred, asserting that such American tactics were impossible, and reversed the damage to 3 Japanese carriers. Despite the emotional supplications of the Red player, his plea was overturned, and his tactics were recast along lines more in keeping with Yamamoto's vision as to when and where the foe should show himself. In a second incident, the Japanese side was playing through the ramifications of an attack by American land-based aircraft against Nagumo's force. The table judge for the event, Lieutenant Commander Okumiya Masatake, rolled dice to determine that 9 hits had been scored, resulting in both Akagi and Kaga being sunk. Ugaki then personally intervened to revise the number of hits downward to 3, leaving Kaga the sole victim of the American attack. Later in the exercise, Kaga was allowed to reappear as a participant in the follow-up operations against Fiji and New Caledonia. Both of these events reinforced the opinion of many of the assembled officers that the operation was fundamentally flawed. However, it was clear that the commander-in-chief was not prepared to listen to reason on these matters. Interestingly, near the end of the exercises, Yamamoto himself asked what Nagumo would do if an enemy carrier force appeared on his flank while he was engaged in operations against Midway. All eyes turned to Air Officer Gender, whose internal reaction might well have been, "If that happens, we're in terrible trouble." But what he uttered instead was a famous Japanese military phrase, "Gaishu Ishoku," one touch of the armoured gauntlet, meaning roughly, "We'll wipe them out." Captain Miwa then rose to declare that, because Japanese defensive power was unbreakable, the matter was of small concern. Coming from 2 officers in a navy whose renunciation of all things defensive bordered on the fanatical, these fanciful answers put a capstone on 4 days of scripted silliness and underlined the air of unreality that pervaded the operational planning as a whole. Yamamoto was apparently somewhat put out that 1st Air Fleet staff didn't have a credible answer to his question. But as another student of the battle has pointed out, he had little grounds to be upset at the failure of a subordinate to supply an original answer in the midst of an exercise that had been so heavily choreographed as to be meaningless. Having done his best to quash all criticism, Yamamoto had thrown honesty and creative thinking out the window as well. Yamamoto did take this opportunity, though, to interject an instruction to Nagumo and his staff that they should reserve at least half of Kid Butai's attack aircraft in readiness for an anti-shipping strike should the need arise. However, these orders were verbally transmitted to 1st Air Fleet. Nothing was ever put in writing. At the time, the instructions seemed clear enough. As events would prove, though, their intent would be far from clear-cut a month later. At the end of the exercise, the situation remained much as before. Yamamoto's battle plan was unchanged in almost all particulars. The games had served as a monologue. There had been no intellectual discourse, no learning. The entire affair had been a mockery of professional staff work. The net result was that Nagumo would go to battle armed with practically nothing in the way of realistic contingency plans. Whatever difficulties arose would be his to handle, alone. Only 2 days after the games concluded, word came back from Admiral Inoue and Cardiff 5 that a pair of American carriers had been engaged in the Coral Sea. The initial assessment of the battle's results was mixed. Light carrier H, operating separately from the fleet carriers, had been attacked and sunk by American naval aircraft. In the exchanges that followed, the Japanese had attacked both American flat-tops, which they identified as Yorktown and Saratoga. It was believed that they had been left in a sinking condition. However, there was no positive confirmation of these losses. As it developed, Lexington had indeed been sunk, but Yorktown, despite heavy damage, was able to escape. In return for these successes, the costs to Cardiff 5 had been high. Shikaku was badly hit by 3 bombs, which wrecked her flight deck, started several fires, and killed 108 crewmen. The Japanese were fortunate that she was not only one of the sturdiest Imperial Navy warships afloat, but also that she had few aircraft on board at the time of the attack. Nevertheless, she could no longer conduct flight operations and was forced to retire. Zuikaku, though undamaged, was effectively rendered hors de combat by aircraft losses. Worse, the operation to secure Port Moresby had to be abandoned, much to the disgust of Combined Fleet's staff, who wanted the operation to continue despite Cardiff 5's losses. As cooler heads prevailed and more information came in regarding the encounter, Yamamoto and Ugaki took stock of the situation. Ugaki noted certain disquieting implications of the battle for future operations. In his diary entry for 7th of May, he wrote, "A dream of great success has been shattered. When we expect enemy raids, can't we employ the forces in a little more unified way? After all, not a little of the present setback should be attributed to the insufficiency of air reconnaissance. We should keep this in mind." Prophetic words indeed. Yet, Ugaki and his chief on board Yamato apparently missed the larger implications of Coral Sea, namely, that the last shred of operational legitimacy underpinning Operation MI plan had just been destroyed. Nagumo would no longer have his trump card to play should the need arise. Even assuming, as the Japanese did, that both the American carriers had been sunk at Coral Sea, the US Navy could still potentially have as many as 3 more available to them in the Pacific Enterprise, Hornet and Wasp. Indeed, it was clear from the Doolittle raid that the Americans had been operating at least another pair of flight decks, besides the ones encountered in the Coral Sea. Kid Butai would no longer be bringing 6 carriers to Midway, although it was not clear that Zuikaku would be unable to participate in the coming operation until she reported her air group losses more fully on 14th of May. Given that the Americans might have as many as 3 fleet carriers and Midway's air complement at the scene of the forthcoming battle, this meant that there could be no guarantee of numerical superiority for Kid Butai. This should have been of grave concern to Combined Fleet, but evidently it was not. In fact, Combined Fleet's staff, notwithstanding having received word that Shikaku and Zuikaku had been damaged in what was supposed to have been a sideshow, bitterly condemned Inoue and the commander of the carrier striking force, Vice Admiral Takagi Takeo, for failing to continue offensive operations despite the very real possibility of losing its 2 newest fleet carriers. Such a reflexive inclination toward the offensive points again to a complete lack of perspective within the Imperial Navy. It was as if the mere act of attacking was more important than fighting in a manner that held out the best possibility of success. For their part, the men of Cardiffs 1 and 2 were treating Coral Sea as a victory, as the superficial evidence suggested it was. If Cardiff 5 had been handled a bit roughly in the process, it could be chalked up to its relatively junior status. The joke in the wardrooms ran that if the sons of the concubine, meaning Shokaku and Zuikaku, could win the victory, the sons of legal wives should find no rivals in the world. This revealed a rather condescending and wholly unwarranted view of the relative skill of Cardiff 5, not to mention a misreading of the true importance of the losses Kido Butai had just suffered. With Shokaku and Zuikaku out of the picture, a serious reappraisal of Operation MI was called for. Yet nothing of the sort occurred. Ugaki's diary reveals no mention of concern that his superior's designs might have been somehow awry now that a third of Nagumo's air power had suddenly been rendered unusable. When Shokaku limped into Kure on 17th of May, Admiral Ugaki went on board to visit the wounded. He commented on his feelings of pity for the men, many of whom were terribly burned. He might well have reflected on what Cardiff 5's experiences portended for Midway. In all truth, the results at Coral Sea should have given Ugaki and Yamamoto all the warning they needed that this was not the same war as 5 months ago or even 1 month ago. Indeed, a perceptive observer would have noticed a number of worrying trends revealed by the Battle of 7 to 8 May. For one thing, American carriers had been lurking when no one expected them to be there. With their unwelcome appearance, Japan's dispersal of forces in the face of a mobile enemy had just been shown for what it was, an invitation to piecemeal destruction of valuable assets. In this case, the asset in question had been a light carrier, which hardly constituted a crushing setback. But the amount of American ordnance that had hit Shoho would have sent any 2 Japanese fleet carriers to the bottom in short order, had they been present to receive it. Equally ominous was the fact that American carrier pilots had been shown to be qualitatively different from much of the opposition the Japanese had faced thus far. American naval aviators didn't shy away from combat. They flew aggressively and were certainly more skillful than many of the Allied aircraft over Borneo, Java and Malaya had been. The US Navy's primary carrier fighter, the F-4F Wildcat, wasn't a match for the Zero, it was true. And the Americans' main torpedo plane, the TBD Devastator, was well past its prime. But the SBD Dauntless had been shown to be a fine dive bomber, capable of lugging a heavy bomb load and delivering it with accuracy. Likewise, American dive bomber pilots had been proficient enough to score 3 solid 1,000 lb bomb hits on Shokaku, despite her being one of the fastest, toughest carriers in the fleet. The hapless Shoho had been smashed by as many as 11 bomb hits and 5 torpedoes. Taken together, the bloom was distinctly off the rose in terms of Japanese carriers somehow being immune to damage. Before Coral Sea, not one had been so much as scratched by the enemy. One look at Shokaku's shattered bow and flight deck should have given Ugaki all the evidence he needed to begin revising his opinion of the Americans and what it would be like fighting them. Yamamoto, however, was in no mood to recast his plans or move the dates of the operation backward in order to wait for Cardiff 5's reconstitution. From all appearances, Shokaku would be months in the yard. However, the landing operations against Midway required a full moon, which meant that if the troops were not landed before 8th of June, the whole operation would have to be moved back a month. Furthermore, the weather in the Aleutians was awful most of the year, and if landings were to be made on Kiska and Attu, they needed to be made before June was out. In other words, if Operation AL was to be carried out at all, it needed to occur as Combined Fleet had ordained. Yet again, the timetable for a strictly subordinate operation, in this case in the Aleutians, was helping drive the primary operational plan. At the very least, the Japanese might have tried to reconstitute Zuikaku's air wing in time to participate in MI. Unfortunately, the organization of Japanese carrier air groups hampered them in this respect. Unlike American carrier squadrons, which were independent and interchangeable units that shifted from carrier to carrier at need, Japanese groups were organic to the ship itself. As such, if either the carrier or the air unit was mauled in the course of combat, both components were withdrawn until they could be reconstituted. This was an inherently less flexible organizational arrangement than that of the Americans. But if ever there was a need for some enlightened improvisation on the part of the Japanese, it was now. If Zuikaku's air group was to be resurrected for this operation, both aircraft and pilots would need to be scraped up, but they appeared to be available. When Zuikaku returned to Kure, she carried her own aircraft as well as refugees from Shokaku. These totaled 24 Zeros, 9 dive bombers, and 6 torpedo planes operable. An additional 0, 8 dive bombers, and 4, later raised to 8 torpedo planes, were believed repairable. That gave a maximum of 56 aircraft to work with, which totaled 25 Zeros, 17 dive bombers, and 14 torpedo planes. This was 7 aircraft short of Zuikaku's nominal establishment of 63, but was still roughly equivalent to the totals being carried by the carriers of Cardiff 1 and 2 at this time. Admittedly, this force would have been composed of aviators who had not flown together before. But if there was one thing the Japanese Navy had going for it, it was a remarkably high degree of tactical homogeneity. Events later in the war were to show that IJN pickup teams could operate together successfully. It is hard to escape the conclusion that Zuikaku could have been made available if her presence had been considered vital. However, Yamamoto apparently did not feel any sense of urgency regarding her. In light of having supposedly sunk 2 enemy flat tops in the Coral Sea, Japanese intelligence estimates now suggested that the Americans had only 2 or 3 carriers in the Pacific II of the Yorktown class, and perhaps the Wasp. In addition, it was felt that the Americans might have 2 or 3 converted carriers, but they were judged by the Japanese to be unfit for active duty with the carriers. Thus, in the matter of fleet carriers, Nagumo should have an edge of 4 to 3 in the worst case. The consensus among Combined Fleet's staff officers was that this seemed good enough. If this was the depth of Combined Fleet's strategic calculus, it represented a pretty shallow level of analysis indeed. For one thing, American carrier air groups were larger than their Japanese counterparts. And while current intelligence placed only about 50 aircraft on Midway, it was also recognized that the island could be rapidly reinforced with large numbers of aircraft from Hawaii. It was obvious that holding an advantage of a single carrier did not constitute a reasonable margin of superiority over the possible laundry list of opponents, even if they were encountered sequentially, as Yamamoto's designs intended. Should the unthinkable happen, and Nagumo have to combat both threats simultaneously, he would be operating at bare parity in aircraft. Zuikaku could have given him a crucial edge, and yet on the eve of what Yamamoto conceived as the decisive battle, the battle that was supposed to determine the fate of the war and whose cardinal importance had been ingrained in every Imperial Navy sailor for the last 20 years, the Japanese were evidently unconcerned enough with the outcome that working Zuikaku back into the mix wasn't deemed worth the effort. This stands in stunning contrast to the Herculean efforts the Americans were shortly to perform between 27 and 30 May in patching up Yorktown, in time for her own rendezvous with Destiny off Midway. In sports parlance, the only conclusion that can be reached is that the Americans simply wanted the win more than their opponents. The US Navy was willing to adapt to changed circumstances, was willing to put in the hard work it took to overcome the obstacles to success. The Japanese were disinclined to go to the same lengths to secure the fruits of victory. If this was symptomatic of victory disease, as some writers have ascribed the mental complacency and sloppiness in early 1942 that led to Japan's forthcoming defeat, then it was a malady that sapped the imagination and diligence of those afflicted. In contrast to the unstinting efforts that had characterized earlier Japanese victories, Combined Fleet was sleepwalking into its most important battle ever. This same haphazardness was being felt all the way down the line. The general shape of the battle had been sent to operational commands as part of Naval GHQ's Navy Order No. 18 on 5th of May. Initial operational orders were issued on 12th of May that began moving units toward their assembly points. However, given the tight time frames, the final operational orders for the lower-level commands were not cut until 20th of May. Likewise, the fleet was finding it difficult to distribute the new codebooks needed to support the operation, having delayed its changeover from JN25B to the new JN25V variant from 1 May to 27 May in the scramble. At the same time, several of the needed ships were still undergoing repairs. Carriers Ryujo and Junyo, cruisers Takao and Maya, as well as several destroyers assigned to the northern operations, were all in maintenance. The same was true of the bulk of 20th, 24th and 27th destroyer squadrons assigned to the Midway invasion force. Destroyers Ushio, Oboro and Akabono, which had just returned from the Coral Sea operation, were shunted north to Ominato for use in Operation AL. They arrived one day before the Aleutians forces were scheduled to sortie. As a result, preparations and training for battle were skimpy at best. Lower-level map exercises were hastily convened, but in many cases not all the officers who were to participate in a given operation were physically present, because their ships had yet to arrive at their respective marshalling places. Similarly, the Army's North Sea Detachment was first organised on 9th of May at Asahikawa, and then shipped out less than 2 weeks later to Ominato. Once there, they and the Maizuru SNLF troops participated in a single practice landing exercise on the 25th. Overall, the units involved were simply going to have to draw on past experience to do the best they could in the coming operation. The final episode in this rather shabby tale of Japanese preparations played itself out on the very eve of Nagumo's sailing. In a final conference held on board Yamato on 25 May, war games again pointed to the possibility of flaws in Yamamoto's operational scheme. During this exercise, the Red player promptly sortied to the west from Oahu and then headed north at high speed. During the subsequent fray, Japan suffered 1 carrier sunk and 2 damaged, while Red lost both of its carriers. It was pointed out after the exercise that if Red forces appeared south of the Hawaii Midway axis, there would be a gap in the air search pattern for the fleet. It was also noted that coordinating the widely separated friendly forces would be quite difficult under conditions of strict radio silence. Some of the officers were of the opinion that the main body was positioned too far from Nagumo's carriers to be able to provide effective support. Yamamoto again asked First Air Fleet staff about their ability to repel an attack should the Americans appear unexpectedly off Midway, and was once again given bland assurances by Nagumo and his subordinates that they were prepared for such a contingency. During the same exercise, Admiral Nagumo dropped a bombshell Kido Butai would not be able to sortie the following morning, 26 May, as planned. His carriers needed more time for provisioning and other preparations. Nagumo asked that the timetable for the entire operation be pushed back a day. Other lower-level commands, under strain to get their units prepared in time to sortie, supported his request. They also wanted the ability to change some of the assembly points for their forces, because there had been problems supplying all the ships with necessary oil. Yamamoto demurred. If Nagumo couldn't sail, so be it. But the operational imperatives remained the same. The tides around Midway weren't going to accommodate Nagumo's tardiness or that of the other units. The landings had to take place as scheduled. Nagumo would simply have 1 less day to knock the island out. In so doing, Yamamoto explicitly acknowledged that Nagumo's new timetable meant that Tanaka's invasion convoy and its covering forces would in essence be a day ahead of where they were supposed to be relative to Kido Butai. As such, they would be exposed to detection and attack before Nagumo could deal with the threat from the island. However, this was a calculated risk that Yamamoto was prepared to take. The incredible part of this episode is not so much that Nagumo couldn't sail on time, although that was bad enough. Rather, it was the fact that no shred of the operational plan was adjusted to accommodate the new sortie date. Yamamoto may well have been right that the overall timetable was essentially driven by tidal forces, and that the schedule for invasion was therefore immutable. But at the very least, some contingency plans, even of a verbal sort, ought to have been put in place to deal with the likelihood that Tanaka and Kurita's invasion forces would be detected prematurely by the Americans. Yet nothing of the sort apparently occurred. Neither Nagumo nor Yamamoto could have left the 25 May conference in good temper. All in all, as one Japanese naval officer later remarked, for a naval force which was the protagonist in the most ambitious plan of the Imperial General Headquarter in the war, this was a precarious situation. At the end of nearly 3 months of top-level bickering, the fleet was shortly to head out on a mission whose goals were questionable at best. The operational plan was impossibly complex, its disposition of forces mutually non-supporting, and its timetable overly rigid. Compounding these basic operational problems were errors in execution as well. Any staff officer worth his salt could tell that Operation MI hadn't been wargamed properly, and there had been too little time for training. The plan hadn't been revised to accommodate the unexpected absence of 2 crucial flight decks, nor in light of the other developments in the Coral Sea. Nagumo's late departure, coupled with yet another wholly predictable failure to revise the positions of the invasion units or the operation timetable, had been the icing on the cake. Chihaya Masatake perhaps summarized these multiple failures most succinctly when he wrote later of Combined Fleet. It could not be said of them, "Everything was done that was humanly possible." Under this cloud of ill fortune, Kido Butai sailed to meet its fate 2 days later. After exiting the inland sea on the afternoon of 27th May, Nagumo's force proceeded through the night on a southeasterly heading. They woke to a brilliant sun rising over the bows of the ships. Now swinging due east, they cruised along at 14 knots. The men, as usual, rose at sunrise, with breakfast being served about an hour thereafter. The crews then got down to business, cleaning the ship, tending the machinery, and participating in combat drills. For all the men, though, there were ample opportunities for recreation. Indeed, steaming to battle often afforded more such occasions than their normal peacetime routine did. The pilots amused themselves by playing card games or shogi, Japanese chess, loafing in the ready room, or sunning themselves on the flight deck near the island. Others read the popular novels that passed around endlessly through the ranks or played musical instruments. Some of the men had learned from their experience in the South Pacific to bring folding wooden chairs with them, so that they could recline at their ease on the decks. Every afternoon after lunch, the crews were assembled on deck to exercise and sing martial songs. This was designed to keep morale up and imbue the men with fighting spirit. Some of the officers, however, let the men mix up the musical fare with more popular and less militaristic numbers from back home. It was important to get the younger sailors buy-in on such matters to get their full participation. Conditions on the ships quickly became somewhat squalid. Fresh water was limited, particularly on longer cruises. The destroyers, whose tankage space was much more limited, suffered more in this regard. As a result, bathing was held to a minimum. This was a deprivation. The evening bath is a Japanese ritual. Since showers were unknown in their warships, the men were limited to washing their hands and faces before meals. As a result, the crew had to ventilate the ship to ensure that the air did not become foul. This was done throughout the day, with the men opening groups of portholes, even during battle steaming conditions, under the supervision of the officers. On a war mission, the cooks made special efforts to ensure that the men were given tasty rations. The crews were indulged with fresh fruit and delicacies such as ohagi, sugar and red bean rice cake, and shiruko, red bean soup with rice cake in it. Overall, the mood in the rank and file appeared relaxed, as if they were simply on a pleasure cruise. However, overnight on the 27th-28th, at least one bad omen had befallen the task force. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, the leader of Akagi's air group, had fallen ill. Already feeling under the weather at the time of the force's departure, he had doubled over during the evening. He was diagnosed with acute appendicitis. Fuchida pleaded in vain to postpone the inevitable, but Akagi's surgeon overruled him and operated immediately. For the air groups, this was disheartening. Fuchida was a popular commander, and the men would miss having the Pearl Harbor attack leader in their ranks during the battle. John Keegan, in his book The Face of Battle, noted that battle is neither strategic, nor tactical, nor material, nor technical. Rather, what battles have in common is human, the behavior of men struggling to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation, their sense of honor, and the achievement of some aim over which other men are ready to kill them. The study of battle is therefore necessarily a social and psychological study. More important, though, battles belong to finite moments in history, to the societies which raise the armies which fight them, to the economies and technologies which these societies sustain. Keegan's words pertain precisely to the study of naval combat as well. Indeed, they are perhaps even more pertinent in a nautical setting, for the study of naval warfare, more than any other form of combat, holds the potential to completely subordinate the human element to the weapons themselves. Naval combat is conducted almost exclusively by means of machines that are in many cases so huge and grand that they often seem to take on a life and personality of their own that transcend the tiny figures that inhabit them. Yet, in the final analysis, it is men who live in the ship, command and fight the ship, and often die in the ship. Their story, no matter how seemingly eclipsed by the great vessels they serve in, is still the fundamental story to be related. Any study of the first mobile striking force, no matter how technically grounded, to some degree must also be a study of the Japanese Navy in a social sense. The Battle of Midway was fought by Japanese men, who were the products of an intensely disciplined, patriarchal, militarized, and above all, Eastern society. Understanding the battle without comprehending their emotional and cultural outlook is pointless. Of course, any Occidental portrayal of an Oriental society, especially at the space of several decades remove, is, to say the least, fraught with peril. Yet despite this, it is necessary to draw together an honest picture of the Japanese that is comprehensible to a Western reader. Who, then, were the men of Kid Butai? The first thing that must be recalled pertains not only to the Japanese psyche, but that of Asia as a whole. It is simply this, that for more than a century preceding the Pacific War, to be born almost anywhere in Asia was to be born the chattel, either explicit or implied, of a white colonial government. Colonial interests directed every facet of economic and political life in Asia. Asians were not allowed to choose their own governments, their affairs being presided over by administrations whose rule ran the gamut from largely benign to hideously inept and downright cruel. The colony's economic raison d'être was to feed low-priced raw materials and local trinkets to their masters, and consume manufactured goods in return, often at disadvantageous financial terms. As part of this general subjugation, Asians were almost universally regarded as moral, intellectual, and social inferiors by whites. Only in Japan did these general conditions of servility not pertain, and the only reason the Japanese had not shouldered their own yoke was that they had armed themselves to the teeth with modern weaponry. This process had begun in 1853 with the descent of Admiral Matthew Perry's jet-black warships on the Japanese coast, thereby opening Japan to the west, an event characterized more in terms of rape by those who had been opened. This traumatic and unwilling entrance onto the stage of world politics had triggered the social tumult of the Meiji Restoration, which had led to the establishment of a new national government in 1868. Thereafter, the Japanese had, by a combination of cunning policy, ruthless implementation of a national industrialization plan, and frantic effort and sacrifice on the part of the populace, begun transforming their nation into a modern industrial state. Within 40 years, Japan was a major regional player. Within 40 more, she was a world power. The breathtaking scope of this accomplishment had impressed the Japanese as being proof of their own moral superiority. Simultaneously, it had reinforced the inescapable social message that national security was the product of unstinting labour, limited internal dissent, and a plenitude of modern military hardware. Along the way, of course, it had been necessary for Japan to visibly demonstrate that it would not be pushed around by the colonial powers. The object of this exercise had been Tsarist Russia, which the Japanese had shrewdly assessed as being the most proximate, least militarily capable, and most domestically unstable of its potential opponents. The stunning Japanese military successes achieved during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, including the annihilation of a large Russian fleet during the Battle of Tsushima, had served notice that an Asian power had arisen that was not to be trifled with. At the same time, though, Tsushima planted the seeds for Japan's defeat in World War II by creating a warped perception within the Japanese Navy regarding the importance of winning decisive battles. In the prescient words of Chihaya Masatake, dazzled by brilliant victories, the Japanese Navy concluded erroneously that victory was brought about solely by the single stroke of a decisive engagement. Chihaya labelled this a blind belief that spelled disaster. That disaster, however, lay 37 years in the future. The immediate importance of Tsushima in a geopolitical sense was both positive and undeniable. While the colonial powers had occasionally suffered local and largely temporary reverses at the hands of the natives on land, no white nation had ever had its navy beaten by an indigenous force. Particularly since the advent of steam power, the idea was simply unthinkable. For the Japanese to have then followed this achievement by forcing Russia to sue for peace after defeating its army in the field put the capstone on a shocking war. The fact that the conflict had in fact nearly bankrupted Japan and had exposed to the perceptive observer the still fragile infrastructure of Japanese industrial power was overshadowed by the dramatic changes in the regional security picture that resulted from her victories. From this moment, the Japanese had a sense of having arrived on the world stage and believed, with some justification, that the white nations should accord them the same respect they accorded one another. That they did not rankled Japan greatly. This frustration was compounded by a deeply held belief on the part of the Japanese that they were part of a unique and uniquely superior ethnic group. The Japanese were certainly not alone in the early part of the century in considering their own race better than the next, but the Japanese version of this social ill was perhaps more clannish than most. The Japanese harboured the belief that their society was possessed of an unusual cultural homogeneity. Perhaps this notion was driven by their exceptional racial uniformity and homogeneity. Even today, Japan's population is still 99% native Japanese. Whatever the reason, to the Japanese, being Japanese meant a lot more than simply living in one country with people that looked the same. It meant being a part of a group that shared a common culture, a set of mutual beliefs, a uniform heritage and language, and supposedly a common outlook on life. Venture much farther down the path of what it truly means to be Japanese, and the line between rational and semi-mystical inevitably begins to blur. The Japanese people, it was said, were all one race, embodied in the person of the emperor. The emperor himself was held to be divine, a direct descendant of the semi-mythical first emperor Jimmu, who had reigned around 600 BC, and who was in turn supposedly a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. With such an impeccable pedigree, who could doubt that this one true race, the Yamato race, imbued with the true Japanese spirit, was a people of destiny? To a Westerner, particularly Americans raised in a nation where diversity, fractiousness and individuality are a part of the basic social fabric, such flowery notions of a true Japanese race are preposterous at best, downright dangerous at worst. Yet it must also be recalled that Japan was not alone at this time in harbouring ethnocentric outlooks, many of which were a good deal less poetic in nature. During the decades leading up to the war, this belief in Japanese racial unity, of being a part of a divinely purposed people, had been reinforced by the rhetoric of nationalism until it had become the central pillar around which the tent of Japanese militarism was pitched. To this mix were added legitimate and reinforcing grievances against the racism and asymmetrical economic advantage that Western colonialism had created throughout Asia. What emerged was a twisted pseudo-nationalist mythos that promised only ill for Asia and ultimately the Japanese themselves. By divine right, Japan would be the instrument that lifted the hated yoke of white oppression from all of Asia. The Asian peoples would naturally come under the aegis of Japanese society. It was a heady mission indeed. 100 million hearts advancing as one was a common exhortation of Japanese wartime propaganda and it roughly fit the image that the militarists wanted to project to the public and the world, that of a dynamic race fulfilling its noble destiny with a single, almost telepathically felt purpose. The militarists' concept of liberation ultimately proved to be little more than the bodily shoving aside of the white powers so that the Japanese might themselves swill at the trough of economic exploitation. However, that apparently did not sully the underlying purity of this grand vision in their eyes. Neither did Japanese resentment of racist inequality from the West stop it from foisting an equally virulent form of oppression on its own Asian neighbours. To all the internal contradictions of their Pan-Asian mission, the Japanese turned a blind eye. Wrapped in the cloak of heaven-sent purpose, Japan had ultimately moved, perhaps inevitably, first from border fracases and provocations into a state of special undeclared war in China as the 1930s wore on. To the average Westerner, steeped in the winner's history of World War II, any attempt to justify Japan's war in terms of Pan-Asian liberation is simply so much hogwash. The Japanese were aggressors, the Allies liberators, and everything from a moral standpoint has been very much cut and dried for half a century. The prevailing American attitude toward the war was crystallized as soon as the first Japanese bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's sneak attack simply put an exclamation point on the writ of contemporary American moral outrage over previous Japanese aggressions in Asia. Yet, despite the fundamental validity of these Western views, it is important to recall that at some level the Japanese people sincerely believed they were fighting for a larger cause, whose intrinsic good was undeniable. If they were also capable of ignoring the social injustices and outright atrocities, which were many and sordid, that accrued under this banner, then that sublimation came about from a conviction that achieving the larger goal of destroying Western colonialism somehow justified the means employed. This long-standing rationalization lies at the core of Japan's inability to examine and condemn its own wartime actions with anything approaching the sincerity and candor that its victims feel is required. Given the transparent nature of the seemingly lofty ideals accompanying the creation of the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, it is ironic that Japan's destruction of the existing colonial system was perhaps the only goal Japan actually attained during her ruinous war. Whatever the conflict's ultimate outcome, the humiliating defeats inflicted on the Dutch and British during 1941–42 irrevocably destroyed their ruling legitimacy. Within a decade of the end of hostilities, white colonialism would be all but banished from Asia. Of course, it is doubly ironic that this goal was accomplished in a manner that none of Japan's military leaders would have appreciated. Indeed, instead of lording over all of Asia, Japan herself was burned down to cinders for inflicting liberation on her neighbors. Toward America, the Japanese reserved a very particular animus, one based on a long history of Yankee mistreatment that was hardly imagined. From blatantly unfair immigration quotas on the West Coast, second-class treatment of Japanese émigrés, and the economic and social repression of the very sizable Japanese population on Hawaii, the Japanese could point to a long list of grievances against their powerful Pacific neighbor. To this general list, the Japanese Navy added a complaint of their own. A long resentment against what they felt were unfair and insulting provisions in the naval treaties that governed all the world's major navies during the 1920s and 1930s. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and its successor, the London Naval Treaty of 1930, had established caps on major categories of warships. In each case, the Japanese received a lesser tonnage quota than either the Royal Navy or US Navy. The treaties were a slap in the face of the Imperial Navy's self-perception as a world-class force. Worse yet, they placed Japanese quotas of warships at a level that conventional naval strategy of the time pegged as being insufficient for the defense of the home islands. In reality, of course, by signing these treaties, the Japanese were able to avoid an impending arms race against America, which, with their much less developed economy, they could not have hoped to win. The act of placing an artificially low ceiling on America's enormous industrial capacity was a far more effective defense than attempting to match American output. The treaties thus protected Japan against American aggression better than the imperial military could have done on its own. These brutal economic realities were readily apparent to the more perceptive thinkers within the Imperial Navy. Admiral Yamamoto had been a delegation member to the Washington Naval Treaty negotiations and shared the vision of the chief of the naval delegation, Admiral Kato Tomosaburo. Kato argued that Japan's security vis-à-vis the Americans necessarily rested on diplomacy, at least for the foreseeable future. However, the so-called fleet faction was violently opposed to the treaties, and those who supported them. Eventually, the heat of nationalist fervour overcame the cold logic of economics, and Japan announced that it would withdraw from the London Treaty in 1937. Unpopular naval treaties could be renounced with relative ease. The grim truth of the economic gap that existed between Japan and her potential American opponent could not be dispelled so simply. On one side of the Pacific lay Japan, an island nation with few natural resources. She was completely dependent on the trade of other nations to supply her factories with raw materials and her military with oil. On the other side lay the United States, enormous and self-sufficient in practically everything she needed. Even when mired in the midst of the Great Depression, the United States still possessed an economy that was some 7 times larger than Japan's. The inherent and largely intractable unfairness of this situation, in Japan's eyes, inevitably placed the empire in an inferior bargaining position. America knew she was in a position to dictate. Japan was expected to listen. The seeds of the coming war lay in America's misreading of Japan's long-term willingness to be dictated to, coupled with Japan's own inability to completely recognize the implications of these military economic realities should she decide to go to war against her powerful opponent. When the United States began applying economic pressure to first curtail and then roll back the empire's gains in China, the emotional concoction that had been brewing for decades finally came to a boil. With the Japanese occupation of Vichy French Indochina, America had reacted by imposing a total embargo on oil in July 1941. Piled on top of previous curtailments of iron ore, scrap metal, and strategic minerals, the West was using every economic weapon at its disposal to bring the empire to its knees. Japan seethed. To finally strike back, even if doing so meant a ruinous war, was the wish of the entire country. What was even more remarkable was that this emotional fervour was generated in a country that was already heartily sick of its war in China. The public perceived, correctly, that the war against the Chinese tar baby was stalemated and could not be brought to a successful resolution. The Japanese public felt powerless and detached from their own domestic politics, viewing the machinations of the army and navy, the assassinations of government officials by members of the armed forces, and the other unsavoury political acts of their own military with a jaundiced eye. That the prospect of fighting an additional war against the most powerful economy on earth, with the British and Dutch empires thrown in for good measure, could bring a sense of elation to the Japanese public, demonstrates the depth of its resentment against white imperialism in general, and America in particular. It also illustrates the extent to which nationalist fervour had apparently detached the nation's leadership from any ability to engage in a cool, reasoned appraisal of the likely nature and outcome of such a gargantuan conflict. The military culture of the Imperial Navy was the natural result of these powerful and sometimes contradictory societal reactants. Its men were, above all things, intensely motivated to succeed. Duty to one's country and one's family looms large in the Japanese consciousness, and the Imperial Navy's fleet raised this ethos to standards few navies have seen. Perhaps the first thing that an American sailor might have noticed upon strolling about a Japanese man-of-war would have been the seriousness with which the average sailor performed even the least of his shipboard affairs. The Japanese are notable for their earnestness, which to many Westerners comes across as almost mawkish and perhaps even contrived. Contrived it most certainly is not. Japanese society places a premium on conformity, discipline, and a deeply felt need to fulfill one's obligations. Failure to act correctly in the eyes of society results in shame, and shame is to be avoided like the plague, as it attaches itself not only to the individual, but also to one's family, friends, neighbours, and ultimately even the emperor and the entire Japanese people. When used as the basis for indoctrination in the self-referential confines of a military institution, the result was a group of fighting men who feared the shame of ignoble failure more than death itself. Another thing an American would have quickly noticed was the harsh discipline meted out to the enlisted men. To strike a man was nothing. It happened all the time in response to even the most trivial infractions. In the words of one veteran, the Navy appeared to put almost superstitious faith in the belief that brutality and physical punishment made better sailors. As part of that iron discipline, every Japanese military man was expected to conform instantly to orders. Naval pilot Sakai Saburo, who entered the Navy as a seaman recruit, remarked that his petty officers in training were absolute tyrants and sadistic brutes of the worst sort. While his training as a recruit had been brutal enough, shipboard life was, if possible, even more violent. The effect, in Sakai's words, was to reduce the men to human cattle, who never dared to question orders, to doubt authority, to do anything but immediately carry out all the commands of our superiors. Yet insubordination was not at all unknown within the military, though curiously it often manifested itself in the officer corps. Junior officers in both the Army and Navy had a reputation for violence, even against their superiors. Ultra-right junior officers had assassinated several prominent political figures, including Japan's Prime Minister during a brief mutiny in February 1936, for trying to curtail the military's budgets and activities. In like fashion, a group of relatively junior Army staff officers, led by the infamous Lieutenant Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, had fomented the Mukden incident of September 1931. This became the pretext for Japan's invasion and consolidation of Manchuria. In 1937, junior staff officers of the Kwantung Army essentially started the current conflict against China on their own initiative, betting correctly that their superiors in Tokyo would be reluctant to rein them in and thereby lose face. Likewise, while the Navy liked to think of itself as the more educated and world-wise of Japan's two services, violence was hardly unknown even within the ranks of its flag officers. When the planning for Pearl Harbor had been in full swing, Admiral Yamaguchi had learned of a version of the attack plan that scratched his Cardiff II from the operation. Accounts of the ensuing incident vary, but all agree that a highly intoxicated Yamaguchi essentially assaulted Nagumo, placing him in a judo headlock and demanding that he relent and include Soryu and Hiryu in the operation. Kusaka apparently intervened and separated the two. For his part, a similarly intoxicated Nagumo had threatened to knife Admiral Inoue at a garden party being held by no less personage than Prince Fushimi, the emperor's uncle. Many saw Yamamoto's appointment as head of the combined fleet as an effort to remove him from the very real threat of assassination in the politically charged snake pit of Tokyo. Yamamoto, like Inoue, opposed the powerful fleet faction, and it was felt that he would be safer in Hashirajima. Thus, despite the rigid discipline inherent in the service, violent outbursts, often abetted by alcohol, were apparently within the norms of acceptable behaviour. This, then, was the character of the Navy that fought at Midway, a military force perhaps more definable by its contrasts than anything else. It was an organisation that was both ferocious and sentimental, where extreme loyalty and discipline were matched by an equal aptitude for brutal behaviour toward the rank and file, and a callous disregard for the lives of its men. As events were about to prove, it had put in the hard work necessary to be technically and tactically astute, but it had not matched those efforts with the mental exertion needed to operate at the higher strategic levels required by a global war. At 14:30 on the 28th, Nagumo's force sighted ships on the horizon. This was Kido Butai's supply unit, consisting of the oilers Kyokuto Maru, Shinkoku Maru, Toho Maru, Nippon Maru, and Kokuyo Maru. They were escorted by destroyer Akigumo. As soon as these ships integrated themselves into the formation, Nagumo ordered a course change to the east-northeast. Things began to settle into a routine. Cruising speed was maintained at 14 knots in consideration of the fuel needs of the force's escorts, as well as the somewhat slower speed of the oilers. Destroyers were notorious fuel hogs, and when conducting high-speed operations, their consumption rates could jump by a factor of 10 or more. Therefore, all commanders took pains to ensure that their escorts were topped off as close to the battle site as possible. Each ship refueled at least twice en route. The destroyers did so almost every day. The Japanese Navy wasn't as proficient in underway replenishment as the US Navy was, and as a result, their refueling operations were slower and more cumbersome. Larger ships used the less efficient astern refueling method, wherein a 6-inch hose was passed aft to a warship trailing the oiler. Destroyers sometimes did so as well, but more often they refueled side by side with the tanker. These evolutions went on almost continuously as the fleet headed east. Each day during the transit, one of the 4 carriers was designated the duty ship for the force. Soryu had the first watch on the 27th. As such, she was responsible for keeping a small combat air patrol contingent above the fleet at all times during daylight hours. In addition, the duty carrier worked with the cruisers and battleships to maintain anti-submarine patrols. ASW watches usually amounted to no more than 2 Type 99 bombers at any time. The duty carrier typically kept a small number of aircraft, either fighters or Type 99s, on the flight deck and warmed up during these hours. Patrols lasted 2 hours, although the Zeros could stay aloft much longer than this if need be. Being the duty carrier meant a constant hum of low-intensity flight operations continuing throughout the day, with remunitioning and refueling taking place in the hangars constantly. On the off-duty carriers, the crews devoted themselves to routine maintenance and training. At this point in the war, the Japanese Navy relied on 3 types of carrier aircraft. The first was the famous Mitsubishi Type 0, A6M2 carrier fighter, in Japanese, Kanjo Sentoki, often referred to by its abbreviated form Kansans, or fighter. A small, highly streamlined airplane, the Zero had first won renown over the skies of China, and then during the opening campaigns of the Pacific War. It was the epitome of the Japanese Navy's offensive spirit, combining extraordinary maneuverability and good firepower delivered by 2 7.7mm machine guns in the front cowling and 2 20mm cannons in the wings. Optimized for low to mid-altitude aerobatics, the Zero was perfect for dogfighting and complemented the samurai-like temperaments of its owners splendidly. In the hands of an expert pilot, it could fly rings around any Allied fighter.